Abilene, Kansas. Clem had done a great deal of thinking after Nettie. Long, quiet, flat Kansas Plains thinking. The kind that happens when you are alone in a cabin for months at a stretch with nothing but the wind and your own conclusions for company. And he had arrived, the way a man arrives at a fence post he has been walking toward across an open field for a long time, at a theory. Pretty meant trouble. Pretty meant options. Pretty meant that a woman could look at what she had and then look at what somebody else had and start doing that particular arithmetic behind her eyes, that quiet and dangerous calculation of what she might be giving up by settling for what she had. Pretty meant a woman who knew her own value on the open market and was not shy about checking the current prices. Ugly, Clem had decided, was loyal. Ugly was grateful. Ugly would step off a train, look at 38 acres on Mud Creek, look at a real wooden floor and a functioning cook stove, and see a good life rather than a consolation prize. Ugly would not be comparing his property to Douglas Faro's at 2 o'clock in the morning. Ugly would stay. It was, without any question whatsoever, the single most flawed piece of reasoning in all of Dickinson County, Kansas, in the year of our Lord 1878. He just had not gotten around to understanding that yet. Mrs. Edna Foss of the Frontier Matrimonial Registry did not have an ugly woman on her books. She had plain women and practical women and sturdy women and one woman from Cincinnati who had described herself in her letter as no great beauty, but whose enclosed photograph suggested she was exercising a degree of modesty that bordered on outright misrepresentation. What Mrs. Foss did have, filed under Missouri, was a woman named Adelaide Marsh. Adelaide Marsh was 30 years old, from Independence, Missouri, and had written to the agency in a letter so relentlessly unflattering about her own person that Mrs. Foss had initially set it aside under the impression that the woman was either the most genuinely humble correspondent she had ever encountered or perhaps not entirely well. Adelaide's letter said that she was unremarkable in face and sturdy in frame and plain as a Sunday sermon. It said she could cook, preserve, sew, mend, manage a household budget with precision, keep accurate records, and treat livestock injuries with reasonable competence. It said she had once helped her father set a broken fence post in frozen ground in January, which she included not as a boast but as evidence of practical character. It said she was looking for a man who was interested in building something, not decorating something. What it did not say was that Adelaide Marsh had auburn hair the precise color of a Missouri hardwood forest in the last week of October. It did not mention that she had the kind of cheekbones that would have made a portrait painter consider a career change, or that her eyes were a shade of green so direct and specific that they had been quietly stopping conversations in Independence since she was about 17 years old and had first walked into the general store to buy flour without her mother beside her. Adelaide knew perfectly well what she looked like. She had known it since she was old enough to notice the difference between how people listened to her and how people listened to her cousin Martha, who was pleasant-featured but not remarkable, and who somehow managed to finish entire sentences in mixed company without anybody drifting. Adelaide had spent 30 years watching men look at her face instead of listening to what she was saying, watching them smile and nod and then ask her to repeat herself because they had been busy looking. She had watched 3 separate men court her for the better part of a year each and then reveal, through the specific nature of their proposals and the specific expectations contained within them, that they had not been listening to a single word she said. She was tired of it. She was tired of her face leading the conversation into rooms where the rest of her was not invited. She wanted a husband who wanted a worker, who wanted a thinker and a builder and a practical partner, who would look at what she could do over what she happened to look like standing in a favorable light. When Mrs. Foss matched her letter to Clem Hadley's letter, the letter from the man in Kansas who had specifically and in writing requested ugly, Adelaide Marsh read it through twice in her kitchen in Independence on a gray November morning, set it down on the table, and laughed out loud for the first time in approximately 6 months. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that comes before you can arrange your face. She wrote back to Clem Hadley the same afternoon, while the particular quality of that laugh was still in the room with her. "I believe I am exactly what you are looking for," she wrote. "I look forward to disappointing you. Clem did not understand that last line when he read it. He turned it over in his mind for several days and eventually concluded it was a form of humility, a modest woman warning him not to expect too much. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about quite a few things at that particular point in time, though he could not have known it, standing in his cabin in December with her letter in his hand and something that might have been hope stirring carefully in his chest, the way a fire stirs when you finally get the wood right. The train from Independence pulled into the Abilene depot on a Tuesday morning in March, blowing coal smoke across the platform and depositing the usual collection of humanity onto the Kansas dirt. Clem Hadley was on the platform in his good shirt, which was identical to his regular shirt but had been washed specifically for this occasion, holding his hat with both hands and conducting an internal conversation with himself about the fact that he was not nervous. He was, in fact, considerably nervous. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the horse, assessing it with a brief but thorough glance. She looked at the flat Kansas plain stretching away from the depot in every direction like God had taken a rolling pin to it, and she looked at it the way a person looks at something they intend to understand rather than something they are merely seeing. Then she said his ranch was south of town. He had said so in his letter. He said, "About 8 miles." She said, "Then we should go. Standing here is not getting the supper made." And she walked to the wagon and climbed up onto the bench without waiting for him to assist her, which was not what Clem Hadley had anticipated from any woman, plain-featured or otherwise. The 8 miles to Mud Creek were the quietest 8 miles of Clem Hadley's adult life, and Clem Hadley was not by nature a talkative man. What struck him was that the silence was not uncomfortable. He had expected awkwardness, the strained and effortful silence of two strangers obligated to each other by correspondence. What he got was something different, a quiet that had some kind of quality to it, like the silence of a room where someone is reading rather than the silence of a room that is empty. Adelaide Marsh sat beside him on the wagon bench and looked at the land the way someone takes inventory. She watched the color of the soil change as they dropped toward the creek bed. She noted where his cattle were grazing and where they were avoiding. She watched the sky with the attentiveness of someone who had read about Kansas sky and understood that it rewarded attention. After about 4 miles, she asked him how deep his well ran. He said 40 feet, good water. She nodded and said nothing for another mile. Then she asked whether he rotated the south pasture or ran cattle on it year-round. He said year-round mostly. She made a small, quiet sound. Not a criticism precisely, but the sound a person makes when something they had suspected turns out to be confirmed. He looked at her sideways. This was not the conversation he had mentally rehearsed on the way to the depot. He had prepared for questions about whether the nearest town had a proper church, how far the neighbors were, whether there were other women nearby. He had not prepared for a woman who arrived in Kansas and immediately began interrogating his grazing management. They reached the ranch. The cabin was solid and Clem had made certain of it before she came, had spent a week in February making sure every board and beam was in the best condition he could manage, that the cookstove stood level and clean, that the real wooden floor he was proud of was swept and sound. He showed her in. She stood in the middle of the room and made a full, slow turn, looking at everything. The stove, the pantry shelf, the single window, the 2 chairs at the table, the ceiling where he had replaced 2 boards the previous fall. She said, "It is a good cabin." Clem felt something in his chest ease just slightly. Then she said the north wall was going to need rechinked before the real cold arrived. And the pantry shelf would need a second tier before winter or there would be no room for a proper amount of preserves. He opened his mouth. She was already rolling up her sleeves. What Clem Hadley had expected from a wife, plain-featured or otherwise, was the competent management of a domestic situation that had been declining quietly for years in the way that bachelor households decline when there is no one whose particular job it is to notice. Cooking, cleaning, mending, the general maintenance of a human habitation rather than a temporary shelter. What he got in the first week alone was something considerably beyond that inventory. On Monday she rechoked the north wall using a clay and straw mixture she made herself from memory, having apparently read an article in something called the Prairie Homesteader's Companion, which she produced from her trunk with the calm authority of a craftsman producing a specific tool. She knew the ratios. She knew the technique. The wall, when she was finished, was better sealed than any wall in that cabin had been since the day it was built. On Tuesday she reorganized the pantry and presented Clem with a written inventory of everything in it, what was there, what was needed, what had apparently been purchased sometime in 1876 and not examined since, including a tin of salt pork she held up between two fingers with an expression that communicated more than a paragraph of words could have managed. On Wednesday she made biscuits. They were remarkable. Clem ate 4 of them and did not say a word because he was a man who had been eating his own cooking for 6 years, and the intensity of his response to a genuinely good biscuit felt like more than the moment could properly hold without embarrassing him. On Thursday she asked to see the cattle. Not to look at them. To have them explained to her. Which animals were producing, which were not performing, what his breeding plan was for the next generation, whether he had given consideration to the bloodline coming out of the rocking H spread near Salina that had been producing strong calves for 2 seasons. Clem stopped walking. He said, "How do you know about the rocking H bloodline?" She said, "I read." "Is that a problem?" It was not a problem. It was the most genuinely startling thing that had happened to him since the Nettie Gage situation, and it was startling for reasons that were entirely different and considerably more interesting. He had sent that letter to the matrimonial registry because he wanted simple. Because he had a theory about plain women and gratitude and loyalty and the absence of that dangerous arithmetic behind the eyes. What had stepped off the train and climbed onto his wagon bench and begun asking about his grazing rotation was not simple. Simple was not the word for a woman who rechoked walls from memory, cataloged pantries with written inventories, made transcendent biscuits, and had opinions about cattle bloodlines in Dickinson County before she had been in the county for a week. He stood in the pasture looking at his cattle and then at Adelaide Marsh, who was looking at the cattle with a focused and evaluating eye, and he had the first quiet intimation that his plan had encountered something it had not accounted for. By November, Abilene had formed opinions. Small towns in Dickinson County in 1878 operated on a simple economy of information. Everybody knew everybody's circumstances, and the business of a bachelor rancher who had sent away to a registry in St. Louis for a mail-order bride was currency of the highest denomination at the feed store, the barber shop, the dry goods counter, and every church social within a day's ride of Mud Creek. The town had anticipated a forgettable woman, plain and practical, who would settle Clem Hadley down and keep his cabin from developing the particular atmosphere that bachelor cabins develop when there is no one managing the domestic situation with any real intention. What Abilene got instead was Adelaide Marsh, who showed up at the first church social of October in a dress she had sewn herself from cloth she had ordered specifically, nodded in greeting to every person in the room with the direct and unhurried manner of someone who was not seeking approval and not offering performance, and within 40 minutes had engaged Judge Roy Callum in a conversation about the proposed new road east of town that had developed, quietly and politely and entirely without personal animosity, into a complete disagreement about whether the route should run along the ridge or the creek bed. Adelaide had facts. She had thought about drainage and spring flooding and the practical requirements of supply wagons in wet weather. She presented these facts in a clear, even voice that did not apologize for their existence. Judge Callum was a man who was accustomed to being the person in any room with the most considered position on civic matters. By the quiet consensus of everyone present, Adelaide Marsh was right and Judge Callum was not. Clem had stood by the refreshment table through this exchange and experienced a feeling he needed the entire 8-mile ride home to correctly identify. It was pride. A specific, warm, somewhat alarming pride in the woman sitting beside him on the wagon bench in the dark, and it was alarming because pride meant investment and investment meant that the careful, logical, well-reasoned plan he had constructed in the aftermath of Nettie Gage was doing what all carefully constructed plans do when they finally encounter an actual human being. It was falling apart. On the ride home, Adelaide said that Judge Callum did not appear to enjoy being corrected by a woman. Clem said he did not enjoy being corrected by anyone. She said, "Was I wrong about the road?" He said, "No. Creek bed floods every spring." She had it right. She said, "Good." Just that single word, delivered with the quiet finality of someone for whom being right was the relevant outcome and everything else was noise. Clem stared straight ahead at the dark Kansas road and understood clearly, and without any remaining ambiguity, that he was in serious trouble, and that the trouble was of a kind he had not been anticipating when he wrote that letter to St. Louis. December in Kansas does not arrive with any gentleness. It comes off the Colorado plain with the manners of a debt collector, cold and flat and entirely indifferent to whatever arrangements you had made or whatever you had been hoping for. The blizzard came on a Thursday night. Clem had read the afternoon sky correctly, that specific yellowish gray that the experienced Kansas man learns to respect, and had spent the last usable hours of daylight moving cattle to the lower pasture where the land provided some shelter, breaking the ice on the water trough, and hauling enough firewood inside to last through 3 days of siege if it came to that. Adelaide had spent those same hours tripling the food laid out, filling every container she could locate with water drawn from the well before the cold locked it up, and banking the stove with a careful and methodical precision that suggested she had taken the literature on Kansas winters seriously and had no intention of being caught unprepared by it. By nightfall they were as ready as preparation could make them. What they were not ready for was the sound at 2 in the morning, cutting through the scream of the blizzard, of Clem's best heifer bellowing from the direction of the barn. Early labor, 6 weeks before the animal was due, and something in the sound was wrong enough to pull Clem out of sleep and into his boots before he was fully conscious of being awake. It was his heifer, his barn, his problem. Adelaide was a woman from Independence, Missouri, who had spent 2.5 months in Kansas and had no reason on earth to be outside in the dark in 30 below cold at 2 o'clock in the morning in a blizzard on account of someone else's cattle. He got to the door. She was already there. Coat on, lantern lit, scarf wrapped twice around her head and tucked, her breath clouding in the frigid air coming through the gap at the threshold. He said her name. She said he was going to need a second pair of hands. He said it was 30 below. She said she was capable of counting. And she walked out into the blizzard, and Clem followed her, and when he thought about that moment later, turning it over in the quiet way he turned over things that mattered, he recognized that as the precise instant when the whole shape of things between them changed. Because she had not followed him out into that storm. He had followed her. The calf was breech. He knew it the moment he saw the quality of the heifer's distress, that particular frantic effort of an animal working as hard as it can and making no progress. He had lost 2 calves to breech birth in 6 years of ranching. Both times because he had had no one to hold a steady light while he worked. A lantern held by a tired arm in a cold barn is not a steady light, and when you are working by feel and by firelight there is a point at which the wavering of the flame means the difference between success and loss. He looked at Adelaide. She looked at him. She raised the lantern. She held it for 53 minutes. He counted the time the way you count when counting is the only thing anchoring you, when the number is the rope you are holding onto while you work. 53 minutes in 30 below cold with her arm extended and the flame absolutely still. Her face went the color of candle wax and then past that to something closer to the color of the snow outside. She did not move. She did not make a sound. The light did not waver a single time in 53 minutes. The calf came just before 3 in the morning, wet and shaking and indignant and alive. Clem set it down against the heifer and straightened up and turned around, and he saw that Adelaide's hand had locked around the lantern handle in a grip she could no longer voluntarily release. The muscles had made their own decision about what they were done doing and had simply stopped taking instruction from their owner. He took the lantern from her hand. He took both of her hands in both of his and bent over them and breathed on them, slow and deliberate, the way you coax a fire from the last of its embers, warming each finger back to function one at a time. She said, "Your letter specified that you were looking for a plain wife." He said, "Your letter said you were plain." A silence. The newborn calf found its footing against the heifer's side. The blizzard ran itself against the barn roof with everything it had. She said, "I was describing my character. I thought that was the relevant part." He said, "You thought right." He was still holding her hands. Neither of them moved to change that. Outside, the blizzard did what blizzards do, wild and indifferent and vast. Inside the barn, in the lantern light, with the heifer and the new calf and the smell of hay and cold and animal warmth, something that had been in the process of arriving for several months arrived completely and settled into place like the last log in a well-built wall. They were married by Reverend Dale Horton of the First Methodist Church of Abilene on a Saturday in February of 1879, which was the earliest the roads were passable after the winter and the latest either of them had any particular interest in waiting. The ceremony was brief and honest, which suited both of them. Adelaide wore a dress she had made from cloth she had ordered from the dry goods store, blue cloth, because she said gray was for traveling and she was finished traveling. Clem wore the good shirt. He built her a bookshelf in March, working at it on the evenings and the occasional slow afternoon with a care and attention he had not previously applied to furniture. It was not a perfect bookshelf. The second shelf leaned slightly to the left, which Adelaide observed and Clem corrected on the third attempt, by which point he had built a better bookshelf than he had originally planned on account of having had the practice. She filled it with the 6 books she had brought from Independence in her trunk, and within a year she had written to Missouri for 11 more, and within 2 years the shelf required a companion. Clem read 4 of them. He started with the cattle manual, which was immediately useful. He moved through a history of the Kansas Territory that explained things about the ground he had been working for 14 years that he had not previously known. He worked up to a collection of essays by a man named Emerson, which he read twice in the winters of 1880 and 1882 without mentioning it to anyone, and which he thought about for the better part of both winters in the productive, unhurried way he thought about things that genuinely mattered to him. Over the next 22 years, they turned 38 acres into 94. They built a proper house around the original cabin in stages, adding rooms as the need arose and the seasons permitted, until the original cabin was contained within something larger and more permanent that Adelaide designed on paper with the same precise attention she had brought to the pantry inventory in her first week. They ran cattle and planted winter wheat and put up preserves and kept records and made decisions together at the kitchen table in the evenings with the kind of directness and mutual respect that neither of them had previously understood was what they had been looking for. They raised 3 children, all of whom had their mother's directness and their father's stubbornness and both parents' complete inability to leave an argument alone until it had been settled on the merits. Adelaide considered this evidence of strong character. Clem considered it the natural consequence of his choices and accepted it accordingly. The north wall stayed choked against every winter that came at it. The pantry stayed organized and inventoried. The heifer from the blizzard they named February for reasons that required no explanation, and she lived for 11 more years and produced calves that ranchers in 2 counties made note of. Adelaide Marsh Hadley became in time the most widely respected woman in Abilene and the surrounding county, a distinction she received with the same level expression she brought to most things. When someone remarked on it, she said she simply said what was accurate and that people seemed to find this unusual. She served on the committee that planned the new road east of town, which was eventually routed along the ridge, and then rerouted along the creek bed after the first spring flooding, exactly as she had predicted to Judge Callum at the church social in October of 1878. The judge, to his credit, acknowledged it. Clem told a man at the feed store one afternoon in the autumn of 1893, in the quiet and considered way that Kansas men share the things that are most true to them, that he had written to that agency in St. Louis asking for ugly, and that he had no idea what they had actually sent him, but that whatever it was, he had gotten the better end of that arrangement by more distance than he could readily measure. The man at the feed store nodded because he had known Clem Hadley for 15 years and had watched the whole thing from a comfortable distance, and he thought that was probably one of the more accurate statements Clem had ever made. Clem had written that letter because he was afraid, though he would not have used that word for it at the time. He would have called it practical, sensible, learned behavior based on accumulated evidence. But it was fear of a specific and recognizable kind, The fear of a man who has been hurt by hope and has decided to stop hoping for particular things on the grounds that he can survive without them. Adelaide had come to Kansas because she was tired. Tired of being seen before she was heard. Tired of her face arriving in rooms ahead of her and setting expectations that had nothing to do with who she was or what she was capable of. Tired of being an ornament in a conversation she was trying to contribute to. She had described herself as plain because plain was the part of herself she was prepared to offer, and she had wanted to find out if that was enough for somebody. It turned out to be considerably more than enough for Clem Hadley of Mud Creek, Dickinson County, Kansas, who had asked for simple and instead received a woman who rechoked walls from memory and held lanterns steady in blizzards and was right about roads and read Emerson and built something from 38 acres in good faith and one very cold night in a barn that neither of them had known to ask for. Because some things are too good to know to ask for, which is the only reason fate bothers to give them to you without being asked.